it's getting late and late, I think we should enjoy Professor Brown's. Are you ready? Would you like to approach? And then what's the big deal? Because we don't want to exhaust our speaker.
Well, hello everyone. It's really good to be here, and it's particularly good to be here because the unexamined life is not worth living. Those were the words of Socrates, a personal hero. So those words are woven throughout my presentation, where I want to look at some of the images of the future. And I touch on, I think, by mere chance perhaps, but maybe good planning on the part of the organisers, elements of all the other presenters that have spoken already. Before I start, I do want to just explain my accent, and you will have to wave your hand if I talk too fast, although I am very conscious that it is getting late. So I am at Dublin City University, where I am the director of the National Institute for Digital Learning, which has only been in existence for 2 years. Dublin City University used to have the National Centre for Distance Education. We have a long history of distance and online provision. But my accent, if you can't identify it, is not Australian, but New Zealand. And I have come from New Zealand 2 years ago, just a little bit less than that, where I was director of the National Centre for Teaching and Learning, and at the university known as Massey University, which is New Zealand's major online open distance provider. So that's a little bit about my background, and I come with some fresh eyes. Not so fresh now after 2 years, but some fresh eyes and perhaps, I hope, a little fresh thinking about the topic that we're talking about today. I'm going to use this metaphor of imagery, because I think, first and foremost, for me, the future is messy. The title of the symposium is "The Future is Now." I think perhaps, at best, the future is uncertain, and I'm very mindful of the sobering statistics and data and life stories, really, that were portrayed in the images in our first presentation. So it is late, and I thought, well, I know that I'm standing for you and potentially a drink, so I've negotiated with the conference organisers this little pop quiz, this test. And if you get 2 of the questions right, you're okay for a free drink. But there's your challenge. So you'll see why I've also adopted this metaphor of images. So here's the first question. I'm serious here. You've got to get 2 out of the 3 that I've got. The first question is, what do you see? 8? Someone says? 3. Most of you say 3? Anyone see no number at all?
A circle.
A few of you see no number. Those of you who generally see no number, it could be the light in here. It would be very unusual to see so many women who couldn't see that number, because if you're colourblind, then you can't see that number, and I am colourblind. Very rare for a woman to be colourblind. It may just be the light, but most of you will see 3. Some of you may see a 5. Even an 8 is known, but those of us who are colourblind see nothing. So most of you got that question right. Let's try another one. This one's much easier. If this number is the answer, what is the question? I'm serious, come on. What are you seeing, firstly?
45.
45? People? Anyone see 45 there? A few of you, all right? Must be late. Let's not put you in suspense. So most people will see 45, and that happens to be the instructions that I got, as well as what it says on the internet about the time it takes to come from the airport on the bus. Except it didn't mention in the traffic. Okay, it could be the light in here that is having an influence on your ability just to see those slides. So some of you are now really at risk of not getting a drink. Here's the final question. You sort of got the genre of these questions now. If this is the number, then what is the question? Or this is the answer. What number are you seeing? 1. Oh, good. Lots So you've seen one. Excellent. Well, come on, what's the question? Well then, easy. The percentage of what the world spent every year on weapons that could have put every child into school by the year 2000. Yet it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And Alan talked about the Sustainable Development Goals and mentioned, of course, the Millennium Goals, many of which we failed to meet. This is one we could have with the right will. And I guess the words of John Pilger really come to mind here in his argument that despite the huge advances in our lives, in 50 years, just thinking back those advances, huge advances in technology, the wealth gap between the poor or the developing and developed countries is more than doubled. Some of you can dig deeper and look at just how empirically accurate that is, and I don't want to pick too oblique a message here, or paint too oblique a message, because we have actually been very successful in some areas, but nonetheless, I think we have to be very real and true to ourselves. And in fact, the framing perspective that I want to bring to this presentation is one that's really grounded in or anchored in a moral imperative. A moral imperative of why we need to engage in the opportunities that new models of higher education or education more generally provide. In the language of opportunity, at a time when the very future of humanity is at stake. Unsustainable population growth, real concerns about our ability to feed the planet, let alone the food safety issues, conflict, the deforestation, the urbanisation that we're experiencing, and of course, most importantly, is the issues around climate change. These are the grand challenges that we are facing. And so I suppose with that framing perspective, the question that I really ask is what type of higher education do we want the use of new technology, new learning technology, e-learning, whatever term you want to use here, to serve? And in many respects, I think Alan has helped us answer this question, but I'll come back to that and hope that you also make the connections to the other presenters as I'm talking. So that's the kind of clearing my throat. There are three parts, and hopefully I have time and I'm comfortable if I don't finish everything because my slides will be available and I'm here to talk for the next day or so. I want to talk about numbers, narratives, and nomenclature, which is a fancy word to mean the language we use in this context. I want to ask, what do the numbers tell us? Well, some of the questions I'm posing in the numbers I have already been given, but I'm going to repackage them in another way. What are the narratives that are being told? What are the stories that are being told at the moment about the future, about the role that higher education has to play, and particularly open universities and new alternative, more flexible models? Because there are competing stories. And then lastly, just a little bit about the language. Why language is important, and why we need to be political in our thinking as well as pedagogical. So that's the outline, but the basic thesis I do want to present or leave you with, given the symposium theme that the future is now, well, I think the past can tell us quite a lot about the future. And don't be fooled by some of the images that we're being presented with right now, as you can see, because the future is not all what it seems. And in fact, as these images show, in many respects, the future does live in the past. And this quote from George Orwell, "Who controls the past commands the future. Who commands the future conquers the past," is just as relevant today as when it was first presented. So with that as an organising thought, let's go straight into what some of the numbers tell us, which is just really, I think, excellent that we're able to link into the previous presenters. And I'm going to do this, again, in the tradition, if you like, of Socrates here, by giving three paradoxes. Paradoxes which kind of have more questions than answers. Collectively, we might be able to answer some of them over the next day or so. So the first paradox for me is that blended online and digital, you might call it distance. I know Alan introduced this terminology. I'll call it bold education here, deliberately because of the future theme. Bold education is booming, but the level of concern is growing throughout the world, as you've heard in some of the conversations. conversations. Let me give you some evidence. Here I'm citing from the annual survey that Allen and Seaman produced in the United States, sometimes called the Babson Report, in which we're seeing the growth in online learning in US colleges. I'm sure many of you have seen these annual reports. Here, jumping back to Europe, is data from what was the MOOC scorecard, the European MOOC scorecard, which shows that MOOCs are still on the rise. The bubble has not burst, that MOOCs, we need to treat seriously the growth in MOOCs is not quite exponential, but it's certainly still continuing. Then, though, a little bit more realistically, and hopefully you can deal with two figures on the one slide here. The arrows indicate what's happening in the top slide, the top graph of figure, the proportion reporting that online learning outcomes in education are inferior to face-to-face. So there's our concerns around the way in which online education is being measured against face-to-face, and then perhaps as Ellen really touched on in terms of the language of student success. People use other language. I like success because it's less deficit-oriented, but retaining students is a greater problem in online learning. These are not things that are new for us as traditional distance and open universities. I won't linger on these slides, they just come from the report that was published in February. I just wanted to make sure I gave you the more recent reference, similar trends with some nuances. This one's a little bit dense, but numbers do matter here, and I'll just talk about a couple of points. This slide comes from the annual publication that the OECD published called Education at a Glance. And if you're not familiar with this publication, I think you should make sure you have a look. Really what I wanted to identify here, consistent with what Ellen was saying around growing concerns in terms of completion rates, retention, completion. And as Alan also pointed out, the language and the way we measure these things differ from one country to another. You'll see that I put a little brackets around Greece and also Ireland. These figures are usually delayed by several years before they come out as well, so I think it's another factor to read into the interpretations that they come. This slide comes from 2011. Ireland and Greece, and I might say something about the two respective cultures here, did not have enough data to make it valid to enter anything. I certainly can speak for Ireland's benefit in terms of why that's the case. So what I've done is highlighted New Zealand. New Zealand, you know how I say that, it's not how it's done in Queen's English. So the completion rates and interpreting this in lay language for what are called A-level, tertiary type A, which at the top there is really like undergraduate education, generally speaking. For New Zealand is 66%. And the figures before this table came out were actually much worse. And some of you may be surprised to know, of course, that the figures in the United States are very poor. So the New Zealand government was most concerned about this, most concerned when your country in a league table like this does not appear particularly well either, because you will see that the OECD average is 70%. Of course, we're talking here not online, not open, we're talking all students. The point is that in the New Zealand context, and Alan, I keep picking you out, but I don't know if you've seen this slide. Last time I used this slide, one of Alan's colleagues was in the audience, and she made me promise that the next time I used it, I put the little qualifier text at the bottom. So what this slide shows is where the New Zealand government was so concerned, they did an analysis of the UK Open University completion rates with the university that I came from, which was the major extramural, is a term that's used for distance and online. And on superficial value or face value, it looks like my university wasn't as bad as the government might have thought, although the rates of under 70%, if that's as good as it gets, then I think we do have issues. But the qualifier quote points out that when other factors are controlled for, taken into account, because my university was a dual-mode university, had campus students and online, then actually about the same as the UK Open University. But this study here probably resonates best or connects best with the figures that Alan was talking about in that little conversation we had around what figures other universities report, which are very difficult to get in actual fact. And when you do get them in this report here from Ormond Simpson, I am very suspicious about what we're really reporting, because the data is collected in different ways, the definitions of completion and retention and attrition are very different. But I guess as Alan has challenged us, we have an issue here around student success. And it is of no doubt that governments around the world, and I can only speak for the Irish or New Zealand government, not for them, I can only speak and interpret their policies, are very concerned about investing public money in higher education with this type of return on investment, taking perhaps a fairly narrow view of completion. So where this paradox, if you like, between higher education booming through new online technologies on the one hand, and then these growing concerns, they often all come to the intersection around issues of quality. A little bit of publicity for one of the reports that I was a co-author of earlier in the year, reviewing different quality models. But I think for me, this argument around quality is a little bit of a distractor. No one is going to argue against quality, but what quality means, it means very different things to different people, and you need to understand the philosophies and perspectives underpinning these various models, rather than perhaps think you can supplant a model and place it into another context. For me, quality, the whole argument around quality is a proxy for a very different type of debate we should be having. And in particular, where quality is being used for new online or open universities to demonstrate that their course offerings are as good as face-to-face, what this is doing is using face-to-face teaching as the gold standard. And in fact, I don't know about your face-to-face teaching experience, I'm doing a bit of it right now, but I fell asleep quite often. It wasn't a gold standard for me. Enough said. I need to go a bit faster. Paradox 2. The public and private benefits of higher education are clear for all, but there's a growing risk of social and economic exclusion, and I can't really say this in any better words than we were given in those opening slides, but I will, in my own effort, attempt just to ground this paradox in some data. This slide here comes from the state of California. California was in crisis in higher education a few years ago. I'm less connected there now, but the study showed that for every $1 US invested in higher education, there was a $4.50 return on that public investment back into the state. This is to argue against this sense in which somehow money spent on education is a cost to society, not an investment. Let me use a UK report. And this one, degrees of value, how universities benefit society. Here, just on 3 indicators: greater political interest, higher interpersonal trust, and better health. You could say 3 kind of softer indicators. This economic analysis estimated that the return on investment was over £1 billion from university graduates. I'll leave you to go into the details, and I also need to put a qualifier in all of this. I'm not an economist. I'm going to go back to education at a glance here, because this sort of has currency. The various reports that you see published, I guess you have to ask who's publishing them, who's funding the studies, but this is the OECD. This gives you an analysis of the return, the private costs, and the net benefits of tertiary education, higher education, if you like, for a woman. I've singled out Ireland here because I note that Greece does not appear on this, but Ireland is interesting because it has one of the greatest returns on public investment in higher education. So on the one hand you have the costs, and on the other side you have the return, broken down between earnings of what they call net benefits, social transfers taken into account. Again, it's too late in the evening to bore you with the detail. Let me give you an analysis. This is a different year set for men, and there is quite a significant difference between men and women, I have to say. There are structural reasons, but there are probably deeper reasons as well. For men, again, I've just used Ireland, but on this occasion, Greece and New Zealand also appear, and you can see that we're at extremes of the figure. In the case of Ireland, as I indicated with the woman, there is a very high return. on the amount that's invested in higher education and the return on for the public benefits and also the private benefits. In the case of Greece and New Zealand, they are much fewer or less, but the important point is not to be distracted by maybe the country differences entirely. They are on the positive side of this graph, because this graph could go actually to the under the x-axis if there was a negative return. Just to give you an interpretation of the case of why New Zealand may be very low, is New Zealand has a lot of new immigrants. And so the new immigrant population swells the numbers that go through into the university system. And so it's still too early in terms of the level of data to really take too much of an interpretation of what impact that has. That's an explanation given by the OECD. So I think there are a lot of local contextual reasons you could read into it. Getting towards the end of this, I can't recall the reference. I'll have to pull this one out to put on my slides before they go online. But this slide here just shows, using other indicators, the proportion of adults that are reporting they're in good health, the proportion of adults that believe they have a say in government, the proportion of adults reporting that they volunteer at least once a month, and then finally the proportion of adults reporting that they can trust others. All indicate when you have higher education, you have greater self-reported data here as a benefit. And then the last, I think, slide I've got might be more for my benefit than yours, just to give you an indicator. But this one is a European study that looks at higher education and then its return on perceptions about the environment. And given what I said earlier, what this shows is the countries that again have invested in higher education have citizens that report much more empathetic and not only empathetic but sympathetic, if you like, leanings towards the need to protect the environment, but also demonstrate actions that they take. So there's just a weighted evidence that higher education matters. To turn that, though, into some of the more sobering reality, here I'm telling you nothing. And of course, this only goes to 2014, and this is Europe as a whole in terms of the percentage of unemployed. Let's have a look a little bit more at Greece, and I'm not sure how accurate these figures are. They come from a reliable source, but they, I think, only go so far as 2014. I think it's 2015 data, 2015 that was published, 2013 that goes far. I'm sure this story is slightly different now. And then if we again use the data from the European Commission, at risk of poverty or social exclusion, these are figures that the Commission publishes. Notably, Ireland is very high as well. The Irish economy is doing much better, but Ireland is still seen as at risk of social exclusion. Just to put that into lay language, it's estimated that 24% of the European population are at risk of poverty and social exclusion. 24%. So on the one hand, here this paradox is, without dispute we know the impact that investment in education can make to people's lives, their communities, and the countries and societies they live in. But we have this situation. What educated group would live with this situation, I ask? Then the third paradox is, while the benefits of higher education have been quantified, and I've just given you some of the evidence, we know very little about the tangible return on investment of the subset of learners that study through open universities or online or through distance delivery, through the alternative, more flexible modalities. I'm using here Greg Rumble, who's probably the person that has done the most work around the economics of distance education. Semi-retired, or I think probably more like retired, but still dabbling. Argued in a book published last year by Terry Anderson and co-edited book that there's almost no understanding of the private and social benefits of distance and online education in comparison to face-to-face. So all the data that I shared with you about the benefits, with one or two very odd exceptions and not well that one can generalise from, we do not know what those benefits are for that subpopulation of learners. So on the one hand, the modernisation report that Pete was talking about, and this was the one that came out last year, there was a series of 3, one of its recommendations was the need to open up more flexible models of delivery. So on the one hand, we have the Commission saying that through these reports. On the other hand, we don't actually know what the benefits might be socially, culturally, environmentally, and probably most importantly, economically. In my own case, in Ireland, and this is my number one priority in Ireland to change, is in total, 16% of the total population of higher education students are defined as studying in a flexible way. In New Zealand, 56% of all students were part-time. In Ireland, it's 16%. Actually, it's worse than that, much worse, because the total number of the whole population of students who study in Ireland at higher education level, third level as it's called there, 2.7% are through distance education. How come? And Pete touched on this in his presentation, the funding model. The restricted funding model, because there is no funding whatsoever for a part-time, off-campus, distance student. The funding model, free fees, is just for campus-based education, which is, of course, we all know, where you get a real education. Of course, these slides, as I say, kind of dovetail neatly into Alan's talk, because part-time student numbers in the UK, he used the expression dropping like stones. Because I come from down under, we would say dropping like flies as we swap them. And there are a complex range of reasons to explain. I would invite you to have a look at a book that was just an online book published last week, sponsored by the UK Open University, that has a number of chapters exploring some of the questions I've already raised around the economics and it's the finance stupid and the benefits of us understanding why we should be investing in higher education. I won't take time to go through this, but at the moment, all I'm left with, because I don't have the numbers to argue back what are the benefits, I just don't have the numbers that could link them to GPD growth. I'm left with these kind of narratives from individual distance and online learners. Incredibly powerful, and hopefully you'll scan that slide as I've been talking. I'll just finish it off with this next slide. A woman who went from a single mother with a young child on a benefit where the taxpayer was supporting her, to then, through her ability to study, contributed now to society, working for a government department with a sense of self-belief, no longer on a benefit, her life having been changed, and now contributing to society directly through taxation and indirectly through the contribution she makes. But that's not good enough. Policymakers, Treasury officials will not change their funding models, their regulations on these narratives. So the challenge is we need the numbers. But who's going to talk first thing tomorrow, hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit about how big data might help us. What narratives are being told? I'm just watching the time, so I'm a little over here, so I'll try to wrap up pretty quickly on this one. Well, there are competing images or stories being told. This is the cover of the report that I don't know if I'm going to get my fingers snapped, Pete, for showing this. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to or not. It's only the cover of the latest report that Pete was talking about. So if we want to use this imagery of landscapes, the changing pedagogical landscape, well, there's an image that comes to my mind when we talk about changing pedagogical landscapes. Alan had a great one on his opening slide of the sort of tsunami. And I'm sure many of you will have heard and read this report that there's an avalanche facing higher education. There's an avalanche coming. This was in the context of MOOCs, and of course it shouldn't be overlooked that this report was really commissioned by Pearson Education. So that's a different kind of image that we're being told about the future. And then this comes from New Zealand, this picture. Some of you may recognise it. Is it The Hobbit or is it the Lord of the Rings? I think it might be Lord of the Rings. The important thing is that an educational change is neither natural nor normal, constant nor common, as it involves a deeper struggle over who will win control of education, or the curriculum in the broadest sense. So this conflicting perspectives, or these conflicting perspectives, this is serious stuff. This is not trivial work that we're talking about here, and we need to engage. And for me, the way to help us engage is actually going back to theory. Theory gives us the opportunity, the lens to understand better what's happening. And so in my case, I'm going to use here the lens of a kaleidoscope. When I was a young boy, I had a kaleidoscope, and you may remember when you turn it, the colours change. You see different things. Well, because I'm colourblind, so I see very different things to you. That's why I've got some unusual views here, perhaps. So I want to just do this very briefly, and I've written a paper that's coming out shortly. The whole paper is about just this model here. For me, at a very simplistic level, so I emphasise very simplistic, what we have going on is a struggle between the forces of the knowledge economy and the time-honoured tradition of the learning society, and that in particular is in Europe. And you could almost draw this distinction between UK and US and Australia and New Zealand in this knowledge economy era. In the New Zealand case, since Pete introduced the term export education, very few people understand that the third largest income earner for the country in New Zealand is export education. First, the learning society. The modernisation report that I cited before, actually I will just go back to this just to explain it a little bit. I know I'm short on time here, but all these terms that we're hearing, e-learning, digital learning, technology-enhanced learning, all of these terms are being used by different interest groups for different purposes. And we need to understand those purposes. So here, for example, in the last modernisation report published by the Commission late last year, this quote, we risk being left behind as other parts of the world act more nimbly. I wonder what they're really talking about, being left behind. Is this education? Or are they talking about the economy being left behind? Even in this report on education, for me it sort of smacked a little bit more of the knowledge economy a driver. Of course, these have to go hand in hand. This is not a dichotomy. So let me just tell you 4 brief discourses. The first, these are the different sub-stories. The first, education historically has always been about reproduction. The reproduction discourse, and what we've done is a wonderful job of reproducing privilege. We've been very successful in education. Mass standards, quality standards, mass education, education now as a commodity. These are all terms that fit this kind of view of education. Now, though, in the era of the MOOC, we're really talking about the reschooling discourse, the language, and somehow we're changing education not. And the reschooling discourse, particularly in the case of MOOCs, is very monolingual. English is privileged, arguably neo-colonial. I come from a country that was colonialised by the, well, I won't point out who they were, but I come from a country that has experienced that some kind of sense of global curriculum, creating this ultimate free market for higher education where costs will be driven down, and somehow in which there's a crisis because education's in change and we must respond. I balance that with sort of traditions that come out of the learning society, and remember I did say all of these I've written extensively to unpack, so you're getting the very short version. Deschooling is about opening up education, democratising education, unbundling. I have a bit of a problem with the deschooling view nonetheless, and sometimes I can give you examples here, because for me the role of the state, and we talked about vision, reproduction is not a dirty word here. Reproduction of culture and heritage in today's globalised world is actually very important. We're not all the same. And so I think the deschooling movement on its own is going to struggle to succeed. And I position myself more around the reconceptualist story that's being told. And I think, Alan, it resonates in your presentation because this is about education for a diverse society, for a socially just society, an inclusive society, one in which we understand that education isn't in change, but actually our role is to prepare education for the change, to be in control, to have agency here. I'll elaborate that a little bit more shortly, and in particular I'm going to return not to the Sustainable Development Goals here, but go back even further. So for me, as I said, there's this distinction between education in change and for change. We should be talking about education for change, not in change. But for me, the Sustainable Development Goals, as they're now written, are rooted and anchored in this work way back, and often called the Deloitte's report from UNESCO, the pillars of learning. Ultimately, what we're talking about here is learning to be, learning to know, learning to do and learning to live together. At the time they placed a strong emphasis on learning to live together. When you boil it all down, this is what education we should be aspiring to, except I will add a fifth pillar, which is learning to change and transform, because if we just continue to do what we've got, we're going to get what we've always had. For me, this provides a very powerful framework for thinking about the future. In fact, there's a European study that takes that framework and looks at how well Europe is doing. I don't expect you to see the detail here, and I chose not to identify particular countries. But the truth is, on the definition of those four pillars, we are not doing very well. So finally, I know I'm way over time, so apologies. Language. Why is it important? Because the language we use is rooted in our identity. Open universities, as the presenters before me have shown, have a long history, a tradition. Alan asked the question, really in many respects, has their time come and gone? I'm not sure, and he wasn't sure either. But there's lots of language we use. Distance education. We now have, of course, language like future learning, technology-enhanced learning, Coursera. What do all these mean? Well, they are important. People don't just choose these terms without giving them deliberate thought. And to my mind, I think it is time for us to be thinking about new, fresh language. Little publicity as much as anything, but it's an example intended to hopefully have some integrity. When I came to Ireland, we used the word OSCAL, an Irish word for distance education. It had no connection with people, it had no meaning, people didn't understand what it meant. And distance education is a sense of correspondence education with a bad reputation in some cases. So what we did, after much thought, created a new brand, dare I say it, DCU Connected, for our off-campus, part-time, mature learners. What's significant about this is not selling DCU to you, but the word connected, which is not original, fundamentally moves away from thinking about a delivery model, fundamentally moves away from thinking about where someone is, to positioning this in the world of the learner, and the learner, wherever they might be in the world or the country, being connected. And that's a very significant philosophical shift, which I don't have time to elaborate on. So, wrapping up, online learning, MOOCs, whatever we want to call it, open universities even, should be in the service of big ideas, not the big idea itself. And at the moment, I don't see enough discussion about what the big ideas really are. The new Sustainable Development Goals, I think, are very powerful for us to keep focused on what we're really about as educators. And I return to that first question. What type of higher education system do we really want? From what I tell, this question is very relevant here in Greece. I do believe we can answer that question and have agency to change it in our respective countries and in Europe more generally, because the images of the future that we present and we talk about, if we don't understand what we want, then we may actually do a great deal of damage, not just to those we teach, but to the system we create. So on that note, it's well over time. I got tired, you probably got tired, and I stand before you and possibly a drink if you're lucky. Thank you.